All right, welcome to BrainSTEM, the podcast for anyone curious about the brain, brain development, and brain disorders. I'm your host, Dr. Hilary Marusak, and today I'm joined by a very special guest host, Natalie Thurston. Hi, Natalie.
Hi there. Great to be here.
So excited for you to be here. Today's a really exciting topic. We're exploring the growing science around social media, scrolling, and what it all means for mental health, especially for children and young people. Our guest is Dr. Emma Duerden, a researcher whose research examines how early life experiences shape the developing brain with a focus on resilience, cognitive ability, and children who face adversity from the very start of life. Emma, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the pod.
So let's start off with a question about early adversity. So a lot of your research focuses on early adversity, what's happening in the developing brain and resilience, including those who are born preterm or those with autism spectrum disorder. So can you first give us an overview of like what drew you to research this topic in this area?
So I started off studying pain, physical pain, and how does being in pain impact cognition. And so that's what I largely did for my PhD. Then I wanted to study pain processing in populations which can have difficulty with processing or expressing pain. And so that brought me to the world of autism. And then I trained at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto for 3 years during my postdoctoral fellowship. And during that time, I studied brain behavior relationships in children with autism, children with ADHD, as well as children who were born preterm. And so, of course, for the preterm population, but also for, children with autism, ADHD, when I was working with these families, more and more, I'd found out that many of them had been critically ill around the time of birth. And that brought me to become interested in the very early origins of early adversity. And I became an investigator in the neonatal neuroscience program, focusing on babies born preterm who are also exposed to very high levels of early life stress, mainly invasive procedures as part of their life-saving care. And so I continued that work here now at Western University. I have my research program in the NICU, and we also recruit children with neurodevelopmental disorders in the community for our brain imaging studies.
Amazing. I mean, that's such an interesting journey and trajectory, and the work you're doing is so important. Thank you so much for sharing that. And today we're talking about social media, scrolling, and mental health. How does excessive screen time relate to early adversity, or stress on the developing brain?
Yeah, so I actually came to this field about 6 years ago. During the pandemic, we couldn't recruit and test children. Even our hospital-based research was put on pause for almost 18 months. So, in order to really continue on our mission of studying early adversity and studying children's well-being and health and cognition, we pivoted and started doing online studies and asking lots of different questions. Our initial studies weren't really about screen time or social media, but when we started measuring screen time, we became shocked at the overall amount of time that children are spending on screens. So the first study that we did, yeah, it was kind of shocking. So we had asked, it just started off with two questions on a 65 item questionnaire. The question was, how much time was your child spending online before the pandemic? And then how much time are they spending now, right, during the pandemic? And yeah, so screen time had almost tripled like during that time period. And with some families reporting that their children were on screens like 13 hours a day. And we're like, oh, like, is this even possible? So, it was like a crisis time, right? I mean, we were all on screens, everything was on a screen. So then we're like, okay, well, like, let's see over time. So then we started a study where we followed 200 families for 3 years during the pandemic. starting in 2020. And so we did 8 time points in total. And then so we thought, oh, well, when this thing ends, right? We didn't know when it was going to end. We expected, oh, when schools eventually open up, screen time is going to, it will decrease, right? And then it will go back to what we had seen, previously in February 2020. But actually it never did. So it still remained really high, not like triple the before, but it was more than double. And because, it's easy to form habits, right? And then, yeah, so we, looked at those effects. We measured children's mental health. We found that the increased screen time was associated with increased anxiety and depression in the children that we were following long term. We, in like the later time points, we found that social media screen use was, it's not rocket science. We found it was like associated with like reduced sleep but like the reduction in sleep, that was like a really key factor. So because with when we sleep poorly, right? Like we're like more irritable, and we have difficulties with concentration and memory. And so we just saw this like played out over like the 2-3 year period that we were assessing. So with like sleep being a really key piece between screen time, mental health, and emotional and behavioral difficulties in children. So that kind of started us off. And then, since then, we obviously children came back to the lab. We have a number of brain imaging studies that we've been conducting, like over the past couple of years with, healthy children and teens, children with neurodevelopmental disorders, children with concussion, mild traumatic brain injury. We're studying it in toddlers, children, teens, and young adults here at the university. So it really became, just this new area of research. To go out to your first question, how does this all relate to early adversity? Well, particularly in like the social media context, children and teens, they can be exposed to, lots of negative imagery, violent images, and then we're especially during like that scroll, right? Like during those doom scrolls. And we actually did a study with over 500 teens, and we found that passive scrolling for more than 2 hours a day was a risk factor for clinically elevated levels of anxiety. So I do really see digital technologies, like the screen time is kind of the secret thing, right? That kids are doing that you don't know about it. It's not tracked like other health metrics when they go to their pediatrician. So it's not like blood pressure or something like that. It's something that kids are doing on the day to day, and can have adverse outcomes for many of them. Not everybody is affected in the same way, but I do see it as an early adversity factor for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I also think it's just so ironic that we're talking to each other on a screen right now and we're talking about the harms of social media and scrolling. But wow, that was, terrifying, right? We always hear about the harms of social media for us adults, but it sounds like what you're describing is that children might be more kind of sensitive to these exposures. And I think from researchers who come from a background of thinking about like kind of like blunt force trauma, like you mentioned, head injury or traumatic brain injury, the idea that like passively scrolling on a cell phone can have these huge effects. I mean, that's a huge exposure. You said 13 hours per day. Like, how would you kind of rank those different types of exposures, and why is the developing brain so sensitive, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, these exposures are a lot, right? So on average, children, teens, in our studies and others, they spend like 3 to 4 hours a day on social media. So if you add that all up, 7 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year, this is actually the equivalent of about 180 school days, with the average school day being about 6 hours, right? So, and the average school year in Canada, at least, is about 190, 195. So essentially, those 180
Wow.
days are like a second, right? When we think about the numbers, it's like a second school right now for young people. And even like 3 to 4 hours is the average. We have teens coming into the lab now saying they're on a screen for 15 hours on a weekend day, right? So the 3 to 4 hours is, there's a huge range in that. So, how does it impact the developing brain? So, for children and teens, they're very susceptible to rewards, and that is how these platforms, these social media platforms, that's their business model, right? Is to keep us online. We are the product. And they do that through these intermittent reward schedules, right? So the likes and the shares and the little red symbol on your messages, right? That makes us look at our phones. That, causes a little like release of reward chemicals. And, but in the child brain, they are, very sensitive to rewards. We know it's very easy to get children to do what you ask if you offer them, some type of treat.
Little
But
M&Ms or something.
yeah, right. So children are respond a lot to rewards, and but in the developing brain, those reward systems are really active. But like the cognitive control center, our prefrontal cortex, that allows us to put a brake on the reward system. That part of our brain develops last, right? Like in our late 20s or even like early 30s. So, and that's also, important area for emotional regulation, being able to manage what we're seeing online and how we're being affected by it. And with time, when we're constantly being exposed to rewards and having, dopamine flooding that cognitive control center, that's going to even further weaken those abilities even more. For children and teens, they can be more drawn to social media platforms because of their so-called addictive design, but be less able to put those devices down.
Definitely. I mean, TikTok in itself, like that's a very addictive scrolling. Like you said, like that passive scrolling, you'll just go on and on and on. Um, does screen time affect all children equally, or are there some kids, like those with autism spectrum disorder or people with a history of early adversity, are they more vulnerable than others?
Yeah, screens are everywhere, right? They're a part of our lives. So it's it's just pervasive. It's just like the air that we breathe. Obviously, not everybody is being affected in the same way, and particularly like what we're looking at, also is going to be a big driver, right? So it's quality. It's in terms of what we're seeing, but also quantity, right? The amount of time that we're spending. So for children with neurodevelopmental disorders, for children with ADHD, they often, for those who are very hyperactive, they may not even be very interested in the screen because it's not changing fast enough or interesting enough, and they're want to do other things. So we actually showed that in a study that we have coming out, like in young children with ADHD and ASD. We found that children with ASD, as well as children with even typically developing young children, very few of them meet guidelines for limiting screen time use. So they in turn could be maybe more drawn to them. For something like video games, for example, these might be where they're, very engrossing and technically challenging. There can be certain features of them that individuals who are on the spectrum for autism, they can find more appealing. And then also being online, for some individuals on the spectrum, they can struggle with social cognition, so understanding thoughts and feelings in others. So, things online can sometimes be a little bit more explicit and more direct and easier to understand than subtle, nuanced in-person social interactions. So there can be, certain draws, for older children. For children, those, impacted by early adversity, they can have delayed maturation of the prefrontal cortex. And so for children, as well as children, like for our concussion project, right, they can often have damage to the frontal lobes. So in turn, they can, because their frontal lobes are weaker, essentially, like less mature, they can, be more likely to be engrossed and enthralled by, a social media platform. But just as I was saying before, just like for that cognitive control center, because it's only coming online much later, or it could be delayed a little bit more in the case of someone who has a neurodevelopmental disorder. That yeah, the rewarding stimulus can be so inviting and compelling, but they don't have the ability to regulate their emotions and to put it down because of that cognitive control centerpiece not being fully mature.
Thank you. Definitely a complicated picture, but that's why I love your research so much because you're looking at like certain types of individuals and how they're interacting with social media and also just the long-term effects that you're studying these children over time because this is such a new thing to science, this type of exposure. We really don't know how it could have long-term effects on the brain, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things I wanted to ask you too was like, and you've been hinting at this, and that's why I love what you're doing. You're looking at kind of quantity as well as quality of screen time, because I can imagine that there's some kids, who are using it for good things like Duolingo or reading scientific articles. Not that kids are doing that. I'm looking at you, Natalie, but do you think it could ever be protective to have screen time? Are there ways where you think social media or scrolling or screen time could actually be beneficial to youth?
Yeah, sure. Like not all screen time is created equal. Yes, certainly using it for educational purposes or, viewing content online that's been, specifically curated for children. That's at like a slow pace that, they can understand. That, like Sesame Street, right? Like Sesame Street was associated with learning the alphabet and numbers, right? So yeah, but I think one of the key pieces here is the overall amount of time that people. So I think yeah, quality is really important, but yeah, it's definitely the time that people spend on them. So for when we're sitting in front of a screen, this is associated with prolonged sitting, and it's actually a risk factor for increased insulin resistance and a cause of type 2 diabetes in children. Yes, so which is on the rise. So okay, kind of shocking. So avoiding doing anything where you're doing prolonged periods of sitting is going to be promote health. But something like multiplayer video games, like online video games, like they're so engrossing. People will spend 5 hours on them, so it becomes really difficult to limit screen time. So yeah, I think for sure, I think we have to, just what I was saying before about them being so pervasive in our society that yeah, we have to learn how to better understand how technology can enhance our lives rather than harm them.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially like we were saying, like this is so new, like the amount of technology, especially since COVID. And with the younger kids like that have been born into it, like you hear like the iPad kid all the time. So it's these people that are growing up, with so much access to technology. Um, from like a research or public health perspective, what are the most urgent things that like parents, educators, teachers, policymakers should know right now about social media use?
Yeah, I mean, I think with these, recent trials, that Meta and Google were found liable for like an individual person's mental health, and it also in the state of New Mexico, like a similar lawsuit, just was Meta was found liable for violating child safety and privacy laws. These trials are essentially I know instead of the social media platforms themselves, like their content to being on trial, it's actually their design, so that they're shown to be addictive in children. So this is, I think, really important information. For in Australia, they essentially prohibited social media for those under 16. Not all platforms, but like the ones that are potentially harmful, that promote compulsive use. Those have been limited, like by banned essentially for young people. So we're starting to see more and more that yeah, there could be significant harms associated with them. I think for parents, they're buying these products for their children, like they're buying anything whether it's ice skates or a bike helmet, we expect these products to be safe, right? And to be tested. Like that's kind of our mentality. But there's for these products, for social media platforms, they're not held up to any type of standard in terms of health and safety. So I think that's the thing that, people have to be really, really aware of in terms of like the age and the access. I think also, for most adults today, if you ask them, like 50% will say they're, quote unquote, addicted to their phone. So it's not just kids. And so for parents as well, it's important to be like modeling the behavior that you want to see in your children. And so, yeah, this is really challenging, right? Because we have everything on our phones, right? Our phones are like this all in one, like our work email and as well as social media, news, everything. So it's really difficult to manage it, right? I mean, like there was thousands of engineers that that designed these products to make them really appealing to us. So it's really tough. I think it does start like on the day to day, like having conversations. Young people that I speak to, the ones that say that they have open conversations with their parents about screen use, those are the ones who are going to be less likely to have Instagram on their phones or TikTok on their phones, right? They're going to be using screens to learn a new skill or a technique, and less so be sucked into the draw of social media. But at the same time, like with these lawsuits coming out and there being more and more research showing about like these platforms, how they can create compulsive use. We can't just put the onus on the individual, right? So there really has to be policy and legislation done, in like what they did in Australia, essentially, right? Until they're rebuilding them from the ground up with safety guards in place and with child health and safety as part of their design.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. Like, building a level of awareness, I think, like that'll make me think differently about picking up my phone later. But like you said, it's not just that because it's so habitual and now ingrained into our society that we really need like an all fronts approach to this and even just like a culture shift. And I think about like cigarette smoking, which everyone was puffing a cigarette, previously. And it took a long time for not only people to kind of break that addiction at the individual level, but also for kind of the culture and the attitudes to shift around that. So, I think just what you're doing and raising awareness about the lawsuits going on and the actual harms and what the research says is so important. And then I also wanted to just ask about more specifically, like what guidelines can you tell people? Because you already highlighted really nicely just the broad effects on our health, like sitting behaviors, increases risk for diabetes and insulin sensitivity. And you mentioned that a lot of your research is actually finding that social media and scrolling behaviors can disrupt sleep, which has these mental health consequences. So, asking for a friend, what kind of guidelines would you tell people around, using screens, social media, any guidelines or practical help you would give?
Yeah. So the Canadian Pediatric Society, the World Health Organization, encourage setting limits on screen time to about 2 hours a day for children over the age of 5 up till 18. For the American Pediatric Society, they don't set hard limits on screen use. They encourage co-viewing with parents. They encourage like use in moderation, but not specifically for time limits. But definitely for our research, others have shown that the 2 hour mark is important. Like just looking at quantity. For the study that I mentioned, there's also been a meta-analysis with over 1 million data from over 1 million children, showing that there can be increased risk for adverse mental health outcomes by exceeding that 2 hour a day rule. But challenging to do. If you speak with a teenager today, to say that they should only be online for, 2 hours of like shocked, right? It's like, that number seems, yeah, very, very low. Also, in Canada, they did a ban on cell phones in schools. So pretty much all over Canada and all the provinces. I know in the US as well, they also have similar policies and procedures, but it does come down to the individual teacher in the classroom. So yeah, so I think like a lot of work to do there. So it's interesting what you said about smoking. In one of the hospitals here, they have signs on the doors like this is a screen-free meeting room. So it's just like this is like a smoke-free room, right? So I think we're going to see that more and more. It's like, yeah, like for adults, like you're going to this meeting, so don't be on your phone the whole time, right? So I think there is more and more awareness. There's lots of adults who they cannot own a smartphone. They have to get like dumb phones, flip phones, because to the point where they were, yeah, like losing their job, impacting their relationships with other people. They because they were just constantly on their phone, glued to their phone. So they, as adults, could not control themselves. So have to, do all of these workarounds in order to get away from them. So, yeah. So I think this really is on people's minds, and as well, like with these lawsuits, the changes in legislation, people talking about it worldwide. Yeah, I think that we will see more and more change. For practical, like everyday advice in terms like for the home, it's setting time limits, like try to avoid going on screens first thing in the morning. Definitely avoid them before bed, like 1 hour screens before bed. Screen free zones in the house, and then like screen free times, like during meals that everybody has to agree to, right? So that's the other thing. So it has to be in the home, like with families, it has to be kind of a group effort.
No, definitely. And even just talking about, like you said, all the recent changes with the lawsuits and the Australian ban, um, where do you think this field is headed, like research wise? Like, what do you think are the most important questions that researchers need to tackle moving forward?
Yeah, I think people have so I think definitely the future is brain imaging. So it will surprise a lot of people to know that in the addiction literature, addiction, like being addicted to heroin and cocaine, was actually seen as more of like a social justice issue. It was like this is people's rights, like it's their right to access these drugs, and they were obviously had like interactions with like the criminal justice system. So it was actually only in like the 90s and like early 2000s when we had brain imaging research to show it's like, yeah, actually if you're using these drugs, your brain is changing, and actually those people didn't have control. So it wasn't their right or their personal choice to use these drugs. So then it became like a more of a medical issue. So it's surprising to people, because now, of course, there's like all these institutes like mental health and addiction, and so many services that are health based, right? For addiction. So, but that really actually only came about from the evidence from brain imaging. So I think this is really the only way that we can go forward with this. Like for the lawsuit last week, it was based on, so social media is not classified as a behavioral addiction like gambling. So, but they were able essentially to have like enough evidence, like no silver bullet here, that it's like, yeah, actually, like this does really, overactivate like the dopaminergic system in the brain. So they was just based on clinical evidence and, research studies showing a strong association, as well as this, young woman's like personal experience. So I think, yeah, until we really have that and like understand it, then it's going to help us to like better understand how we can make, an informed design of these platforms. Because people like social media, right? People like it. So we need to kind of better understand that, like who is at most risk, So I think that's an important area. At the same time, I would say that understanding like generative AI and like how generative AI is going to change learning and children and mental health. This is definitely on everybody's mind and at the forefront. How is that going to change our brains? And yeah, I think there's like a lot to be done, right? But technology is it's just like it's trying to catch the tail of a tiger, right? You can never right? You can never predict what's going to be next. There could be something new tomorrow, right? And research moves a lot slower than tech.
Unfortunately, that is always the case. Yeah, we'll have to have you back on to talk about AI because I have about a gazillion questions for you about that topic. But that was a really, really nice way of describing like social media and screen time as an addiction. Because I think when I talk to people about like, oh yeah, they get that you can be addicted to alcohol or heroin, as you mentioned, but the thought that you could be addicted to something that's more behavioral, like gambling, like even food, I think is
Mhm.
really foreign for people. That something like in the case of food that is really good for you, that you really enjoy, like at some point can actually be detrimental. And you did a really good job of describing how that could be the case with the people that have dumb phones that just can't, it's so destructive. So I just want to ask you, like, straight up, like, can screen time be addictive? Is it an
Yeah, well,
addiction?
yeah. Well, anything that's going to push dopamine, right? Like in an intermittent reward schedule, like these platforms are designed to do, has the potential to cause addictive like behaviors. So I even heard about somebody who had to drop out of medical school because he was addicted, quote unquote, to playing bridge, the card game bridge, which most young people don't even like know about. It's not for money at all, but it's just so there's about 5 to 10% of social media users show problematic use. So it's the same thing with alcohol, right? Like we can get it anywhere, but there is a percentage of the population who is going to struggle with it and not going to be able to moderate their behavior when using it, right? So whether or not it's ever going to be, an official addiction, time will tell. But yeah, definitely their overall design is to, promote us, with intermittent rewards, is designed to keep us on there. So, and some people will show more addictive like behaviors than others. For children, we have to be very careful about this because children are 4 to 7 times more likely to become addicted to a substance in comparison to adults. Over 90% of adults who have substance use disorders started before the age of 18, right? So we have to be very careful about what we are exposing children to do, particularly when it has addictive potential.
No, absolutely. And like you said, like I feel like kids are getting exposed younger and younger. So like longitudinal wise, I'd be so interested to see like research that looks at over the course of time, what that turns out as. And as someone who's specifically interested in a clinical perspective, do you think that social media addiction or even like internet addiction is something that we could see in like the DSM in the incoming years, is something that people can be diagnosed with? That's just like a definitely a personal interest question.
Yeah, I mean, so definitely like screen time, social media use is on the radar for health organizations. So it is, for the Canadian Pediatric Society, World Health Organization that I noted that does have guidelines for screen use. Definitely for internet use disorder is mentioned in the ICD, so the International Classification of Diseases. This is listed like internet use disorder. So it's very broad. So it's not social media. So that is included. So potentially for the DSM-5 or 6, like the next edition, maybe it will be classed under, more specific behavioral addictions. Maybe it will like make it in there, but at the same time, I don't know if it really matters, so much. It's something that it's here. We all use it, and we do it. There's known risk factors, so It's a known risk factor. So yeah, I think the best thing to do is just like to have the awareness and, try to prevent it, right? Just use it in moderation.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I think you painted a really nice picture that the cards are really stacked against us when all these companies they want us to spend more and more time and there's a dollar incentive. So it's definitely a struggle. But yeah, I want to leave you with kind of the last word. Like, what is your take home message for people listening? Like, what do you want people to take home from this conversation?
Yeah, I think if people are listening to this, they're obviously maybe interested in social media. How does it impact the brain? Like, does it impact the brain? And maybe about like thinking about their own device use. I think for myself, kind of like on this journey, the last 6 years, I've definitely like reassessed like my own use, my own practices. Um, definitely like at home with my family for sure. This has, made me think a lot about it, about, just not using my phone for everything, right? Like not reading on my phone, like, using a book or that sort of thing, just to like give our brains a break. We kind of act like our brains are supposed to be plugged into the internet 24/7, but our brains really aren't designed to do that, right? Like we're supposed to have rest. We have like built into us like a network in our brains that is for resting, right? And we strengthen that as we get older. So we need to have a strong resting brain. This keeps us, very calm. It helps us with our like overall executive functions, how we respond and react and regulate our emotions. So yeah, so yeah, take that walk without listening to a podcast. Exercise at the gym without watching a screen. Exercise outside, right? Like take those little bits of brain breaks to have it in the everyday.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And Emma, thanks so much for being here and just for the amazing work that you do. It is so important. And for listeners who want to learn more, we'll have links to Dr. Duerden's work in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, also shameless plug, please subscribe, leave a review, share it with someone who'd find it helpful. You can find us at BrainSTEM Podcast. Thanks so much. Thanks, Emma, and thanks, Natalie, for doing this. This is fun.
Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
Hilary. Yeah.
Thank you.